Welcome to another Old Frontline Trench Chat. This week we're joined by Amy Harrison, who's a military historian, former Commonwealth War Graves Commission intern, and is currently researching a Ph.D. at the University of Kent in First World War battlefield tourism and landscape. Welcome, Amy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So I always start these by asking people, how did your interest in the Great War begin, and do you have a personal connection to it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my kind of interest levels in it come in a way like most other people's do, really. I have a family link, but I also did start becoming more interested in the themes when I was a teenager, really. And it was an interesting one that I actually became interested in the subject without necessarily knowing my family link first. So I remember at about the age of 14, I, for some reason, and I still am not quite certain why, decided to print out the In Flanders Fields poem by John McCrae and put it up on my wall. And I can still remember the full thing today. But I think that was my first kind of link. And I should probably have known at that point that it was gonna take over my life to the extent it really has. Yeah, and then it was a few years later, as I was an undergraduate, where I started studying it, that I actually found out I had a number of family links to the Great War itself. So, buried along the Western Front, the closest relatives I have are two great uncles and my great grandmother's first husband. So, I'm in that interesting position as well, where if it wasn't for the Great War and the death of my great grandmother's first husband, I wouldn't be here today. So, they've been really key to kind of developing my research into the areas because it does provide that kind of family link. Otherwise, it just came through that academic side of it as well, and that's been where it's really developed for me.
And having these family connections, like you say, is quite important, isn't it? They act as almost like your lodestars when you're out on the ground or studying the subject. They're your link to it. They're your little part of the Great War.
Yeah, they're that personal story that draws you in, and I think they're really the linchpin to then take you into the wider history itself. You are able to have that personal link, which you just identify with, I think, in a very different way. Even if they're not the same surname, for example, you still have that personal link. My grandmother, for example, still remembered her mother speaking about her brothers that she lost. So it does kind of link you to family, to location, to kind of everything, and you just grow from there, I think.
And eventually that led you into that amazing project, which is the Commonwealth War Graves Commission internship. Now, not everyone listening to this might be familiar with what that actually is. So perhaps you can tell us a bit about what the internship is and how it works.
Of course. So the internship was started in around 2017. It's mainly based around the centenary. And due to that development, the commission realised that they'd be able to bring some recent graduates or students out to the Western Front and give them a kind of taster of working as guides, as kind of stewarding areas and learning a lot more about the history. So the Commonwealth War Graves Commission internship, which is also run by the Commonwealth War Graves Foundation, puts 6 students or recently graduated individuals in Tyncott, based in Tyncott and at the Menin Gate in Ypres, but then also 6 more based down at Thiepval Memorial on the Somme, and also based at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission experience down in Burin. It's with the 6 people that are there, you are based in the cemetery or at the memorial each day, and your role is to be the face of the commission. You are the people to welcome guided groups, individuals, tourists, pilgrims, anybody who kind of arrives and wants to know a bit more. And there is also guided tours that are run as well. So we get very good very quickly at leading a big group around a memorial site as well. It's very heavy on research. A lot of us develop really personal stories to do with these men, and it's very intensive. I lived and worked basically at Tyncott Cemetery for 4 months, which is intensive, but it gives you a very personal link to those cemeteries.
And that must have been an amazing experience to be on the ground for that length of time, not just for a weekend or a week, but for several months, and seeing probably thousands of people come through that site. That you must have some amazing memories of that.
Yeah. And you see different people every day. It was different people, different groups of people, and everybody had their own response to the area. What was particularly interesting, and I have done sessions at the university to encourage new students to get involved with the scheme. And the thing I always used to say was, you'll never do a job again where you feel so thankful for what you're doing and where people are so appreciative of the service that you're providing, because you can be there and witness people's most emotional moments as they take in the scale of somewhere like Tyncott, but also as they might find for the first time a relative or a story that they've always heard from family but never had the chance to see. Or and even those who research the area but who have never been able to actually get out there. The importance of being at the site itself is something which every day we would feel. You'd think that working there for 4 months that some of that magic might be lost, but it was something that never happened for us. You'd have one day where you didn't cry and then the next day you would, and that could be 3 days in or 4 months in. It was always different, and you heard so many stories. It was incredible. Yeah.
And do you think it changed your view of the First World War and the battlefields and your connection to them?
Definitely. And for me, it was amazing for my research, which focuses on battlefield tourism. So it was already an area I was interested in, but to actually experience it and kind of understand what it's like, both to be a guide, but also to be somebody who's visiting, was amazing. It brought back a lot of that emotional side of it for me. Sometimes when you're studying it and you can do it at university, you might be writing essays on it, you might lose a bit of that importance of it and the personal aspect. Whereas actually experiencing, as you said, kind of thousands of people over the 4 months, all experiencing in their own way, was very important, and definitely changed, I think, how I perceived our relationship to the First World War.
I suspect it probably also demonstrated that the power and connection that we have to the First World War isn't diminishing in any way.
Definitely. It seemed to be growing when I was there. It was almost the case of returning visitors, for example. We first came during the centenary and now we want to come every year. Or even those, you'd still get groups coming through who would just see the signs and stop on their way to Bruges or on their way up to the Netherlands or something. So it still has a draw, and I think it will continue to do so because there's so many personal stories that can still be told.
And that is what even the casual visitor, when they go there and they see those names and they look at the headstones, it is those personal stories that really connect people, isn't it?
It is. And it draws them, I think, to certain headstones. As you probably know from Tyncott, and a lot of listeners do, there are kind of certain headstones that are visited quite often. The VCs, for example. But the real kind of important thing about being a guide, being an intern as well, is that you're able to bring people to those lesser known stories as well. And, information that they may not be thinking about. So things about how the cemeteries themselves were put together, the concentration of the burials, the identification, even the newer burials, things that people aren't quite aware of, but tie into this whole wider history that's been going on for the full century that people don't necessarily think about when they first arrive at those spaces.
Absolutely. And I think, you as a professional military historian, in some respects, the individual stories, there's a degree of antiquarianism there in terms of their stories, but they are good tools to explain the wider context of the war to people, aren't they?
They're the most important educational tool, I would say. I'm one of those people who's doing a PhD who might be doing it on, military history and the experience, the kind of cultural experience for visitors. But as somebody who's also been a guide, it gives you a very different perspective. You can't look at it from the kind of academic viewpoint when you're trying to engage visitors who don't need that in their kind of storytelling. The important thing is to help people understand with the facts, the stories, and to bring people together in the emotion which they're feeling.
Absolutely. And I think as well that the thing that I like is that people like you and the other interns that have done this, you then go out into the wider world beyond your months on the battlefields and you become ambassadors for all this in many respects. And it's, to me, it's a good sign that the torch of connection and remembrance of the Great War is passing in the right direction.
Yeah, and it's amazing when you're out there how many people are struck by how young we are and the youth of it. It's definitely a comment which we faced quite a lot. There's that, and there always has been kind of across the century, this fear that it's going to be forgotten by the next generation. And I think we are the kind of the visible aspect of those students, those individuals who are taking it forward, and who are bringing this kind of remembrance to a different generation in a different way. Whether or not we're succeeding on that is something else, but you hope that it's helping in a way.
And with it, of course, you bring fresh perspectives to the study of the Great War, which leads us on to the Ph.D. that you're doing at the University of Kent, which is on battlefield tourism and landscape.
Yeah, so it's on specifically preserved and reconstructed landscapes. So if you imagine a site that has either preserved battlefield elements, so Tyne Cot is a good example of that with its bunkers within the landscape, but also museums and other spaces that reconstruct that wartime experience. And my PhD focuses on how important that is to visiting, how across the century that's been something which has always been emphasized, that you're returning to the original space, and how especially in modern day when you can travel around that area and a lot of the time some of your only visible wartime links are going to be the crosses of sacrifice, for example, in fields, how important it is for people to be able to recognize that and link that to their understanding of what the war looked like to them.
And battlefield tourism, it's not a modern thing, is it? It began almost as soon as the war ended.
Yeah, even during. So there was, even during the war, Thomas Cook had to put an advert in the newspaper which said, "We will be running battlefield tours, but we won't be running them until hostilities have ended." There was so much interest. If you think even Motorcar Corner, places like that, the part of their name will come from people who are visiting cemeteries of loved ones, anybody who could get that visa to go out there at the time, that pass. There was still that attempt during the war. But it was really kind of, 1919 onwards that you had this big growth in the hospitality industry in Belgium. And even before a lot of Belgium and France is being reconstructed, you have this tourist infrastructure which is growing up. You've got taverns, you've got hotels, even before a lot of the permanent houses for residents are being reconstructed.
And Ypres is very much at the heart of this at that period, isn't it?
It is, and Ypres is a really interesting one because of the attempts in the post-war period to think about really what to do with it. Do we, as Churchill was kind of trying to argue for in the early 1920s, 1920 onwards, do we keep Ypres? Do we try and get it as a kind of British site to keep it in its ruined state? Because that's what people necessarily would want to see. That's its wartime experience. But as kind of citizens returned there and it grew up as more of this, newly developing town again, it did turn into this real core site of where people would stay and where people would then move outwards into the salient to experience the smaller cemeteries, the larger sites. And again, those reconstructed or still at that time, actual trenches, which could be found in the local area. So it was a real base of operations, I would say, and this sacred place which men returned to and families wanted to experience.
And that sort of developed in those 2 decades between the wars, didn't it, to quite an industry really by the 1930s.
Yeah, a really kind of well put together industry as well. You've got a huge number of tourist organisers who are running kind of charabancs, so different vehicles that are going out and about along the salient. You've got guided tours which are put together, and then you've got these nicer hotels which are growing up. But then you've also got this other side of it, which is the pilgrimage side of it. So you've got charities like the Church Army the Salvation Army, the Church Army, all putting together cheaper tours and cheaper accommodation sites like YMCA places as well, to allow families who have lost loved ones to visit their grave sites for the first time, or where they were, missing. So it's very much got these two sides of it, Ypres. It's got this, well, as it's known kind of in the literature, the kind of profane side and the sacred side. And there's a difficulty in tying these together at points, because if you're there trying to visit your, father, son, husband, and you see, for example, a group of people drinking and cheering, it's quite difficult to see. I think even now we have a view of what we think remembrance should look like. And those discussions happened all the way back in the 1920s. But then a lot of those times, those people who might be being cheerful, having a drink, would be veterans. So there's a very difficult kind of concept about what was appropriate, what wasn't appropriate. And I think that's something which has continued through to today. What do we expect to see in these sites? What kind of behaviours are appropriate?
And the organisations that were involved in the battlefields at that time, I'm thinking in particular of the Ypres League. Do you think that they sort of established our understanding and some of the things that we still see when we go to the battlefields today?
The Ypres League definitely does, to a point. Ones like that, anybody who visits St George's Memorial Church, and actually I've become a member of St George's Memorial Church, and I'm currently on the trustee board. So it's definitely somewhere for people to go and visit if they're able to head out, within the next few years. And I think, they originally do start very similar to the Imperial War Graves Commission at the time, putting up these signs, making sure that people know where to go to see the sites that they need to see. But also I think, and the Ypres League in particular, are part of this sacred nature of Ypres itself. The Cloth Hall, the Menin Gate, and the site of the Menin Gate becoming places which are memorials in themselves, rather than just places of a town, and being so key to British memory. And that's really what the Ypres League is all about, is trying to preserve this memory and make sure that people are aware that Ypres was key to the British experience of the war.
And I think, when you look at the things that the Ypres League were doing, I suppose it was a bit of a reaction to the fact that they didn't get Churchill's wish to preserve it with trees or an aspic or whatever he wanted to do with it, but they could memorialise it, and that became part of their task.
Yeah, they could memorialise it, and they could make it a site which people will always identify with the war, which Ypres itself, I think, recognises and definitely, holds within its tourism to a really key extent. But the Ypres League's kind of attempts to develop things like the church and even the British settlement in the area means that it really did take on this identity of a British outpost at different points, with key links to the Imperial War Graves Commission at the time, to tourism, and to the soldiers themselves, all of whom at that point would have, moved through Ypres on their way out to the salient battlefields. And it took on that identity, obviously, for other nations as well. You've got Canadians, you've got Australians, New Zealanders, everybody who recognises Ypres as part of their wartime experience, I think, were part of this commemoration and this memorialisation of the recognisable sites, which now I think are just within our memory and our collective memory as well.
And at the same time, the Imperial War Graves Commission were beginning the construction of the permanent cemeteries, and that added another layer to it as well, didn't it, really?
Another layer and another kind of identification with the war. So while, sites are being levelled and the landscape generally is starting to recover, you've got the popping up of these more permanent cemetery sites, which a lot of them hold British names. A lot of them hold names which will link back to people's experiences in the war. So there's been a suggestion, it's kind of been a overtaking of British memory there. You will see a lot of links to specific battles, specific areas, and the real kind of, I don't want to say militarization, but definitely, importance of the wartime narrative to that space is found through the cemeteries. You can follow front lines, you can follow battles, and you can follow medical routes as well through these cemeteries. And I think they are sites which are very important, but I think sometimes they are misunderstood in terms of their landscape, in that people may not quite realise, and the Commission are doing a lot of work to try and help with this, that you can follow these stories in a way that if you did so individually, you might not be as aware of, this one is a battlefield cemetery or this one is a medical cemetery, which I think is important for them to try and develop more, as it's, as I said before, one of our key kind of current sites in our memory. We see it so visibly, and we saw them so visibly during the centenary as well, that they're key to how we kind of remember the war now.
And does that, I suppose, change reflect the change in how we view the cemeteries, that in the 20s and 30s they were the place that you went to remember somebody that didn't return, and now they're beacons to the history of the First World War on that landscape today?
Definitely, and they have this odd different kind of strength to them now, in that some people maybe aren't quite aware that they are full cemetery sites. They might think they're memorials in a different way, that every headstone has a body or multiple bodies, and that every name is recorded, is something now which has moved into the history a bit more. You've got obviously the individuals, and like we said, obviously people becoming interested in the First World War through visiting family at these sites, but also the amount of people who are able just to walk the headstones and see the story of the war in sites like Tyne Cot, see the number of unknown headstones, see the different nationalities, the different inscriptions, and gain an idea of the war more generally in a site which might be a tiny kind of section physically of what the old war landscape was, that holds within it so many different narratives that they can then bring out and use more generally.
And the advancement of history then gets in the way of these pilgrimages and the visits to the battlefields, because the Second World War trots along, and the battlefields see fighting once more and years of occupation, and then it begins to change completely after the Second World War, doesn't it?
Yeah, and an interesting way to kind of look at that is to think about the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's development of the cemeteries themselves and the horticulture as well. So in the 1920s and 30s, you have much higher plants. You have ones which almost create this shielding effect for a lot of the headstones, so that people can almost visit and grieve more privately. But then as you come through after the Second World War, and through kind of to how we understand them now, you've got those much lower plants being brought in, and this idea of the white headstones against the green grass, which is our identifying factor for these cemeteries, but wasn't, what they were originally looking like. So it's an interesting one that the horticulture itself kind of reflects our changing relationship with these sites, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission have reacted to that in a way that now it's the site itself, it's that wider experience. And that really started through the kind of 70s and 80s with the first organised tours that started coming out, because otherwise you do get this real dip in visitation after the Second World War.
And those battlefield tours, led by people like Martin Middlebrook and the Holts and Rose Coombs, they sort of sparked again that interest in seeing these battlefields.
They did, and we hit a peak with that during the centenary. The numbers there were some of the highest that had been seen in a very long time. And if you imagine how the different kind of visitors that come to those places now were in comparison to those 70s, 80s, 90s, you have such a wide range of people coming now. You've got school groups coming, you've got army groups coming, you've got veterans from different conflicts who also come out, who follow, for example, their battalions or their regiments. And you've got, as I said before, the casual viewers, the people who are rediscovering family history, because the growth in family history has been amazing for the First World War. People are so much more able now to follow their ancestors' stories. And the Great War is something which is almost a kind of watershed moment there, that there is such a body of research that can be done and that they can find out about and physically see. So it's developed hugely, I think, over the last 40 years or so. And a lot of my research as well has been engaging with people who have been visiting for such a long time, and the changes that appear to have developed in infrastructure, in visitation, in the types of people that are there, seem to be absolutely huge.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen it in my time, how things have changed dramatically, and I suppose one of the key things for modern visitors is how they view the battlefields in comparison to the people that went there in that interwar period. I guess it would be very, very different.
Yeah, I would say different in some ways, but very similar in other ways. I think instead of that personal link, that very immediate family link, people have that more distant link, which I think still does give a very significant emotional pull, whether that's ancestors or whether it's people who look for the local area that they live in, or a school or college or university they went to. Following old boys, for example, is a huge kind of area that people do now. And I think I would suggest that it gives that similar emotional pull. This is the equivalent to those immediate emotional links. But in exactly the same way, with that profane side of it, you do get the more casual visitors. And you've got, the school groups and groups that we might not always see as having the same emotional behavior that those people who have that personal link have. But it doesn't mean that their remembrance is any different to how it's been for the entire century, and that their experience is any less important to their understanding. So it's very much managing it in the same way as they did in the 1920s. It's just that now we have to look more towards that landscape, more towards those narratives to get that personal link than they would have had to do in the 1920s and 30s.
And as you mentioned earlier, the landscape changes to reflect that as well. In the interwar period, there were some veterans who dug trenches because they saw a business opportunity to create a trench museum. And on the modern landscape today, things are constructed and put in place for the same sorts of visitors. So it's gone full circle, really, in some respects.
It has. And sometimes those places which have been freshly dug are going to be the places which look the best in a way. They're going to be the places that people react to because they show the mud, they show the kind of scrap metal, they show the things which people expect to see in their identification with the First World War. And they're useful educationally. I think if there's ever a spark, then somewhere like that exactly the same as originally, they're doing it because it will create that conversation as well. It's a place that will start that education journey, or you hope it will. And yeah, it is very similar, I would say. There's a lot of people who are able to earn money off of the industry, but also a lot of people who I think are doing so in order to help people understand what it was truly like.
Yeah, I think, certainly a lot of the people that I work with, we saw that time, particularly in the 80s, when there were so few people on the ground that visited these battlefields, that we never ever want to return to that. Sadly, we've seen a bit of a shade of that this year with COVID, but I think that is a big impetus really behind it. And I would guess that probably in the interwar period, a lot of people that were providing services on the battlefields were doing it for the same reason. They didn't want to see what was their generation disappear from the history books.
Yeah, the veterans, I mean, you get a lot of guides who either keep their military identity or assume a military identity. And it's that authority as well of I understand it and I was there. So I'll be able to tell you the true experience of what this was like. I'll be able to show you what it really was. And now I think, as you said, that's the same in terms of the educational aspect of it. It's being able to bring people into that experience, which is exactly the same as in the 1920s and 30s. You will always have people who are heading out there and not with the same kind of knowledge. And if they're able to come away with a greater knowledge, then that's always a benefit, I would say.
And as things change, I suspect some people fear that they worry about what direction that will take these battlefields in. And do you get a sense of that from the research that you're doing?
Yeah. A lot of the discussions, focus around how clean some of these sites now are, how sanitized they are, how maybe you're not quite getting this actual experience. But as you said, that link to the 1920s and 30s, you weren't really getting the actual experience there. A lot of the time, you're not going to get that actual experience unless you're there from 1914 to 1918. And Instead, this kind of more sanitized or clean version of it is just something that can bring everybody into learning about it. And there are always going to be those sites which don't have that development. There's always going to be places which haven't been, sanitized, haven't had the visitor centres grown up around them, haven't had, toilets developed outside, don't have that interpretation, where those lesser known sites are generally the places where return visitors and guides who have specific routes are able to go to get that other sense of it. But you do really see it in those kind of honeypot locations, that those are the ones that are very developed, because those are the ones that have such high visitor figures that they need to provide that experience for everybody, as well as those who are returning and those who are there for the first time. And it goes back to that thing of kind of, what are you aiming for when you go out to the Western Front? Is it to gain your own experience of what it was like? In which case there are places, walking the battlefields and certain sites which have less of that development? Or are you there to actually learn about something that you haven't learned before? In which case those larger sites for those with less knowledge are key.
And the way those sites are developed will, I guess, influence how people then go on to see the war, and how they react to the scale of the casualties when they go to somewhere like Tyne Cot. So I suppose there's got to be some good context there for people who don't have any knowledge at all to see that in the wider picture.
And that's what's really interesting about those sites, is when you start, I guess, learning a bit more about the areas, you'll realise how much of that history is missed out and has to be missed out, because it comes back to, as we were saying earlier, that idea of a narrative, and that the storytelling aspect of it is so important to drawing people into the interest of it. So if you think about Tyne Cot, for example, the predominant narrative there is the Third Battle of Ypres. But actually, as a site, it's been fought over multiple times. And the burials there are all the way from 1914 to 1918. And it has its entire post-war kind of history with the commission itself as well. But predominantly, that land is known for the advance of the 4th of October. It's 1917. It's key to kind of Australian memory, to the Battle of Passchendaele itself, to, the mud and the gore which took place at that site. So it's very important, I think, if you're thinking about going deeper into those areas, to look at what the predominant narrative is, because that's the narrative which gives the best story, the best understanding of a site at a specific time. But there will be so many other layers to it. History itself layers on top of each other. So it's always interesting to see what is predominantly at those areas.
But places like Tyne Cot, they're the places that can grab people. I mean, they go there because it's so well known. But when they see the scale of it, there is that, you hate to say it, that wow factor of it. It stops them dead in their tracks. I mean, in the days when we could drive to the front of it, groups I used to have on coaches, they would gasp as you turn the corner and saw all those graves. But that's the point, that you've got these people and you can capitalize on that, can't you?
Yeah, and that's the amazing role of being an intern in a site like this as well, is that you can see that moment that people realize the scale of the location, and you can then expand that into all of those other factors, which, you're completely right, aren't necessarily there at the very beginning, because you do need to draw people in. There needs to be a hook to bring people in to then understand more about the overall experience. And Tyne Cot, I think, is very good at doing that with its scale and also with its visitor centre. Whether or not walking down the side is something that people enjoy doing or not, there's still obviously a lot of groups that walk in through the back entrance. But generally, there is a lot there that, as I said, you can kind of draw out to bring other elements of the wartime experience through. And it's used educationally to bring out so many different themes, whether that's kind of medical experiences, whether it's young soldiers, whether it's the kind of Commonwealth aspect of it, the idea of the missing. There's a huge number of different themes which can all be present. But again, they can't be all thrown at you at once. There needs to be a kind of development to ensure that everybody gets their interest and their education.
Yeah, and this year, of course, with COVID, we've not been able to visit. And do you think that's changed the way we look at some battlefields? And because people have begun to look at alternative ways of being there, virtually, for example.
Yeah, the digital development of this has been so interesting. I think and to me, it just reiterates the importance of space. That actually physically being there and seeing it is key to understanding the war and understanding the events that took place. And the attempts that have come out, whether they're kind of digital guiding, they're using images, whether people are using things like, Google Maps or different photos and different ways to experience it, are still providing that physical space and is still kind of allowing people to be there. I don't think it will necessarily take away from the experience of being, in Flanders on a rainy day, but they're a very good way of still emphasizing that it is the space that is so important to our experience.
And I guess what that shows is people's desire to do that, and then from your own experience as an intern at Tyne Cot, is that this connection to the First World War remains strong and is not fading away, and is growing and will continue in the decades, in the century to come.
I definitely think so. I think family history has been amazing for it. And I think as we move towards the centenary of the Second World War as well, that the interest in how we got there will continue. And family history looking forward to the Second World War as well will still hold, the experience of whether it's fathers, whether it's the same men who experienced a war only, less than 30 years before that. So I think it will still be key to our understanding of the larger historical events that we're going to come up towards in the next kind of 20 years. And I think, the family history will keep going. Maybe the history of it will change, but I don't think we'll lose the kind of experience of it.
And the research that you're doing on battlefield tourism and landscape is still ongoing, I know, but do you think that you'll move towards perhaps publishing something on this eventually?
It would be lovely to do so. Publishing, or alongside that, obviously it would be nice to set up some sort of online blog perhaps to show the results, especially because so many people have very kindly filled in the online survey that I put up. So I think showing those results and the kind of thoughts that have come out for that. I definitely like to, even if it isn't a full book, work towards some articles. So the research will be published. It's just in what form and when. But as you said, it's all ongoing, and there's still so much kind of information to take in. But initially, it's such an interesting topic, and it's such a topic that people have opinions on, and people have their own perceptions of the importance of these sites, the experience of these sites, that I think it gets people talking. It gets people talking about their own experiences and which sites they like, which sites they don't, how, they've experienced touring these battlefields. I hope it's something that people continue to be interested in, and that I'll be able to share that research.
Well, I think a lot of people feel very invested in it, don't they? And I'm sure that they'd like to contribute. They can contribute via a questionnaire that you've got online.
Yeah, so it's just a Google form. It's easy to fill out. It's got my contact details on it as well. Just a set of questions, around 11 questions. They can be as short or long answers as you want. There's going to be a lot of kind of research done into kind of the themes that come out of that. So you'll be adding to a large kind of base of experiences and of different people who are putting forward their kind of perceptions of it. So kind of everybody helps with that.
Yeah, so we'll put a link on the Old Frontline website to that, so people can find that, and a link to your Twitter feed as well, so they can find it through that as well and follow you, I hope. So, I mean, it's an incredible subject, really, the battlefields, because I mean they've been part of my life for most of my life, really, one way or another. And I have a feeling that for you, this is a legacy that will never ever go away. I think once it's under the skin, it's there forever. Looking to the future of these battlefields, it's really important that the internship for young people to go out there continues, isn't it?
I really hope so. I know that they had obviously the issues this year. The interns were sent home while the coronavirus crisis was really developing. But I know that those students were offered a chance to go back, and hopefully that a lot of them will do so, and that it continues. I think a lot of us online ex-interns, as you said, are very good ambassadors for it. We're very encouraging for people to go and do it. It's an amazing experience, and it gives you that experience of guiding in such an intensive, small area, because you're guiding different groups every day, and you do see so many different people, and you learn all of those skills about how to interact, how to get people's attention, and what kind of things will really bring them to understanding the war and be interested in looking at it further. So it's definitely an amazing experience, and especially even volunteering with the commission to be involved with their work and continuing their kind of legacy, I think is key to keeping these battlefields being visited.
And I think with school groups as well, it's really good for them to meet the interns, because it shows to young students that there is a future in history. It's not just an abstract subject that you study in your class, but there is something beyond that class, and it's not just a subject for men.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also it's, the kind of history I do, it's understanding that actually your history can go all the way up to the modern day. Your history can still include people who are living and who will have an opinion on how things have changed across the century. So it can be a lot more kind of relevant than people might think it can be. And it's always something that if you have a passion for doing it, no day that you do it will feel like work. It's probably very much the same for guiding. Every time that you do it, it still feels like something that you feel very lucky to be doing.
It certainly does. Yeah, it certainly does. And I think that, what you've done and what the other interns have done, it just shows that the page of the history of the Great War, that will never reach that last page. It will always be turning, and fresh perspectives will come along.
Yeah, it'll always develop, and there will always, if for anybody who's interested in remembrance and the memory of the war, there will always be a development. There will always be new things that are created. There will always be another Armistice Day, another Remembrance Sunday, which will give us more information about how we use the First World War, how we understand it, and how we still react to it and find it so important.
Well, thank you, Amy. It's been a fascinating discussion about the battlefields and the landscape, and we'll direct people to your Twitter page and also your study that you're doing. Thanks a lot for that, and we'll hopefully get you back on again to see how your research is going further down the line.
Thank you. Maybe towards the end when it's almost finished.
And I hope that's soon. Thanks, Amy. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.